the stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's story is the story of Nirvana. Nirvana was a Seattle, Washington-based band that catapulted the grunge scene of the late 80s and early 90s into global prominence. Led by the enigmatic Kurt Cobain, a high school dropout who, as you will hear, had a unique vision to blend various genres of music that he admired. The result? Nirvana revolutionized rock with their new, raw, innovative sound. Despite releasing only 3 studio albums from 1989 to 1993, Nirvana sold over 75 million records worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling bands of all time and influencing countless others. Here to discuss the meteoric rise of Nirvana from house party band to global stadium success is Michael Azerrad. Michael is the author of The Amplified, Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana, an extensively illuminated version of his classic 1993 Nirvana biography, Come As You Are, The Story of Nirvana, which was named as one of the 50 greatest rock books ever written by the UK's prestigious music magazine Q. Michael was also a former contributing editor for Rolling Stone, and he wrote that famous Rolling Stone cover story on Nirvana from 1992, in which Kurt wears a homemade t-shirt that says, "Corporate magazines still suck." We're thrilled to have him here today to discuss the incredible journey of Nirvana. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, Michael.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Very good. Today we're talking about very seminal band in the history of rock, and it is Nirvana, of course. I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about each of the band members as children, as adolescents, etc., just to get a perspective of who these folks are, where they came from, what their family life was like. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you connected with them, to write the book, etc. So I wondered if we could start there and start maybe with Kurt and how he grew up and, a bit of a troubled childhood, it sounds like, by reading the book.
Yeah, a bit. And it's interesting, this is a good place to start with Nirvana, about where they're from. Not many rock bands really have that much of a foundation in where they came from. I mean, you think about, the classic rock bands, Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or the Rolling Stones. We know where they came from, but it wasn't really part of their origin story, the foundation of their art. But with Nirvana, it starts in a place called Aberdeen, Washington, which is a pretty small town about 2 hours southwest of Seattle in Washington state. And for a long time, many, many years, it was a logging town until the logging industry started to collapse in, I guess, the 70s. And it's a pretty provincial place. Kurt would call a lot of the people who lived there rednecks, perhaps an objectionable term to some. But it is, it's a fairly provincial place. It's also an incredibly beautiful place. The surroundings are incredible. There's mountains and Grays Harbor and the Pacific Ocean coast and incredibly clean air. But for someone like Kurt, who was a very bright, very creative person who yearned to expand his horizons, Aberdeen, I think, was very constricting. So Kurt was born to Don Cobain, who at the time was working as a mechanic in a garage, and Wendy Cobain, who was a homemaker. Wendy actually was not too musical, but her siblings, Chuck Freidenberg, and was a drummer in a local surf rock band, and her sister Mary was a kind of a country artist who sang in bars and taverns around town and did her own recordings and stuff. And I think she was kind of an early idol to Kurt. And so Kurt was raised in what he described as his upbringing was white trash posing as middle class. His mom was really proud, and she dressed her kids very nicely, and she did the best she could with what she had. And at some point, I don't know, maybe, I guess Kurt was like 9 years old, maybe, his parents got divorced, and it made a profound impression on him. He went from being this kind of cheerful, chipper kid to being very melancholy and withdrawn. And that kind of lasted for the rest of his life. We can get into that a little later if you want. But Krist Novoselic moved from Compton in Southern California to Aberdeen when he was about, I think, 14. And Krist was incredibly tall. I think he's like 6'7" or 6'8", and he was incredibly tall when he was 14 too. And he had a very drastic underbite, which was later corrected surgically. So he was very tall, goofy kid, looked different from the other kids. And he was also from Southern California. He dressed differently, talked differently, was into different music. So he was alienated like Kurt was, except Krist dealt with it by being funny. He was, just like real cut up in school. And I think it sounds like he was fairly widely liked, but not really friendly with anybody. And that's the traditional role of humor, I think, is to charm people and yet keep them at arm's length.
Yeah,
and
sounds like the perfect personality to be a bass player. It's like the guy who doesn't want to be out front.
Right. Yes. Yeah. There's also Krist could be up front though. He would interrupt school assemblies by singing the national anthem off key and things like that. He was kind of a goofball. So those two come along and eventually meet. I mean, we can get into how they met if you want, but they start making music together after Krist initially resisted Kurt's advances. Krist was a much better musician technically than Kurt, and he was also 2 years older. So Kurt really wanted to play with Krist. Krist was into punk rock like Kurt, and Kurt, again, was looking to expand his horizons, look beyond the top 40 in metal that people in Aberdeen seemed to favor, and into something more adventurous that looked beyond, his immediate surroundings. So for a long time, Krist resisted Kurt's musical advances, and they finally did start playing together, and went through a succession of drummers.
Yeah, they seem to have more drummers than Spinal Tap, it seems.
Yeah. They were very exacting, but also it was really hard to find a good drummer who was into punk rock. Everybody there was really into metal, and they had, drum sets with lots of tom-toms, and they wanted to play real fancy. And that was just not what Krist and Kurt were looking for. So they found a couple of really good drummers in town, Aaron Burkhardt and then Dave Foster, but they didn't quite fit. I think one telltale sign was that both Aaron Burkhardt and Dave Foster had mustaches, which was kind of a signifier of being a kind of metalhead. I don't know if your listeners know this term, but Hesher. They were maybe Hesher types. So, but Kurt and Krist wanted to be punk rockers, and so they didn't quite fit the image. And they eventually found a new drummer.
And so when Krist and Kurt first met, we're talking what, 1983-ish?
Maybe a little, 84, 85, maybe something like that.
Okay. Very good. And they start to, I guess they're playing what, local kind of gigs? They try to get gigs, and how does that sort of come about?
Their first gig as Nirvana was at a house party in a little town called Raymond, about a 30-minute drive south of Aberdeen. So I think a lot of their shows were just that, or they rehearsed in Krist's mother was a hairstylist, and she had a hair salon in town, and there was an empty space above there, and they rehearsed there. And I think they had a few audiences, just people hanging out, watching them play. I think that might have been a lot of their early gigs, frankly. And then they played on April 18th, 1987. They played a place called the Community World Theater in Tacoma, Washington, as under the name Skid Row. I'm not sure if the more famous
there was a band,
Skid Row.
Yeah,
sorry?
There was a band. Was that
there's a metal band called Skid Row. They may have formed around that. I don't know if they actually had put out a record yet. But Skid Row was, interestingly, a local term. It's from skids for lumber. And they would, the loggers would cut lumber and then slide them down these skids from the hills into the bay or a river to get transported to boats. So that was a little local color. They just
there you go, folks. There's the term Skid Row defined for you by Michael. Wow.
Yeah. And let's see. And then they played. With Dave Foster as Nirvana at a real concert on March 19th, 1988. So that's when they really got going.